Hello, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, and welcome back to part two of insects and plant diseases in vegetable gardens. In this video, I'm going to talk about plant disease, talk really generally about what makes a plant disease show up in your garden, and give some specific examples that you might encounter, as well as some ideas on management, and introduce you to some resources will be really helpful in managing plant disease in your garden. So again, I want to encourage you, get in touch with your county extension agent. Make sure you have them on Facebook. Track me down on Facebook. It's an easy way to find other programs that I'll be putting out in the near future. Subscribe to the YouTube page because you'll get notified when I put another video up. And of course, go to the extension website, extension.msstate.edu. It's going to be a wonderful resource for information about gardening, about health, everything going on with COVID-19. Really a range of information resources for you there. Also encourage you to find Mississippi State University Extension Service on Facebook. If you're interested in horticulture, also join the Mississippi State University Extension Horticulture Hub. That's also going to have a lot of information about programs that are coming up, some great horticulture information, and again, resources for a variety of other topics. So again, in this video, I'm going to be talking about plant disease, and so it's useful to start off with a discussion of what plant disease is. A really broad definition, sort of the formal definition of plant disease is an impairment of the normal state of a plant that interrupts it or modifies its vital functions. And so what that basically means is any change in the plant, whether it be caused by an organism or not, that impairs the growth of that plant. And I always like to start off because I think there's a lot of beauty to be found in this topic with two examples that I really enjoy. The first there is rose mosaic virus. You can see that really colorful yellow pattern on the leaves. And of course, the famous tulip breaking virus that causes that color change in flowers, in the tulip flower there. Really interesting episode in history. If you have a minute, look up the tulipomania and tulip breaking viruses because it's just an interesting note in history. As well as interesting note in plant pathology. So what causes a plant disease? And we can break that down into two really broad categories. The first of those is what we call an abiotic disease. And that just means it's not caused by some sort of foreign organism attacking the plant. So two good examples of those are nutrient deficiencies and problems with watering. Biotic diseases, on the other hand, are caused by an organism that's attacking the plant. And while there are other examples, really the most common things you might run into, certainly the most common will be fungi, bacteria that might be attacking the plant, as well as viruses and nematodes. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit as we go through this topic. A really important concept when we talk about plant disease is what we call the disease triangle. The disease triangle gives us a really good way to think about how disease occurs in whatever environment we're dealing with, whether it be ornamentals or vegetables or any crop. So in order for disease to occur, the first thing you require is a plant that is going to be susceptible to that disease. That's our susceptible host, the base of the disease triangle. And that just means we have a plant that can have a particular disease, and that might be a matter of what species the plant it is. So some species of plants are going to be vulnerable to one set of potential diseases, while they may not be affected by other potential diseases. And the next component we're going to need for a disease to take place is to have a virulent pathogen. And that just means we have the condition there, we have the organism that might cause that disease, and it's capable of attacking that particular plant. And the last component, and a really important component, because a lot of our management is going to focus on it, is a favorable environment. And that may refer to temperature. Most commonly, we're going to think about favorable environment as having the water there on the surface of leaves as a way for that pathogen to establish. And again, a lot of our management is targeted at either reducing the population of the pathogens until the environment changes, or otherwise addressing the environment in order to reduce our problems with plant disease. But it's important to remember that each of these legs are something that we can attack in order to reduce our problems with plant disease. So we can use resistant plants, we can try to reduce the numbers of the pathogens, or we can make sure that we don't present that favorable environment. So when we talk about diseases, a lot of times we talk about different symptoms that we might see on plants. And that symptom is the response of the plant to that pathogen, or the effect that the pathogen's having on the plant. And we can see a lot of different symptoms. I'm not gonna mention every single symptom you could possibly see, just some really common ones. One that you may often see is a gall. You can see that in the leftmost picture. And that's just that swelling of the plant, an overgrowth of cells in a particular area that leads to that really obvious feature on the plant. Now, one of the things we'll talk about later is a disease that leads to galls in the root system. So keep in mind the plant may have galls, but they may be below ground. You may not see them. A really frequent symptom that we see in plant diseases is stunting. And that just means that the plant is not growing to its full capacity. It's much smaller than we would expect it to be, or much smaller than uninfected plants that we have in our landscape are. Rosette is a symptom that we see, in particular because of some viruses, but some other diseases as well, where a large number of shoots all come out from a small area. There's a really classic example of this in roses that can be quite serious. That's the rosette. One of the most common disease symptoms we'll see is what we call chlorosis. Chlorosis is the fancy scientific way to say yellowing. And you can see a picture there. Now, sometimes you may see yellowing, but it's not yellowing of the entire leaf. You may see yellowing of one particular area around the margin, particularly between the leaf veins. We will refer to that as either marginal chlorosis when it's around the margin, or interveinal chlorosis if it's between the veins. A feature that we see particularly in viruses is mosaic, or a symptom that we see. And you can see those raised areas where you have that dark green color that's darker than the rest of that leaf. And again, that's really characteristic of some plant viruses. Another potential symptom we might see is necrosis. Necrosis, again, kind of a fancy word for the leaf tissue dying or the area of the plant dying. And again, you may see that around the margin of the leaf, or you may see it between veins, and we'll describe it as either marginal necrosis or interveinal chlorosis. Now, to contrast symptom, there's disease sign, and that is the actual physical appearance of the pathogen. So you might see the spores in the center of a lesion on a leaf, or you might see that white thread-like growth that you see on that oak leaf there, which are actually the growth of the fungus on the plant. Some other signs you might see: there's a parasitic plant that is growing up in the branches. That's the physical appearance there. You may see nematode eggs on the root system. You may see an ooze coming off of a plant, or you may see streaming of bacteria out of cut plant. All of those would be examples of disease sign. So with that little terminology section done, I'm going to talk a little bit about abiotic disease. And again, that's just diseases that might be environmental. They might relate to a nutrient deficiency or even a nutrient toxicity. And really one of the most frequent things we'll encounter is watering issues. Watering can negatively impact the plant if we do one of two things. If we underwater the plant, if it's under drought conditions, then it's going to get really stressed out and it's going to wilt. We'll actually see very similar symptoms if we overwater. If we give the plant too much water, it's also going to wilt. All of that water that's there in the soil will stress out the roots. It'll send out a signal to the leaves, particularly the leaves at the bottom of the plant, that tell it that it's under stress. And often with overwatering, you'll see yellowing start at the bottom of the plant and move upwards. Obviously, looking at the soil is a great way to look at this. You want to figure out if the plant is overwatered or underwatered. Looking down at the soil is a simple way to do that. Now, one of the symptoms in vegetables that we commonly see that's related to watering is a condition called blossom end rot. You can see blossom end rot very commonly on tomatoes, but you also see it on cucurbits like watermelons and squash, also on peppers. And the growing tip of that fruit is deficient in calcium. So there's very rarely a situation where there's not enough calcium there in the soil, but it's essentially impossible for calcium to be moved around by the plant. So it really needs to be taking up that calcium in a very even fashion from the soil. And when there's watering that gets interrupted, if the plant might be flood and get dry and flood and get dry, the calcium isn't taken up evenly, isn't supplied to that growing tip of the plant, and it causes the death of that tissue right at that growing tip. We call that blossom end rot. And now the real solution to blossom end rot is to keep your watering as even as possible. Of course, if you're using growing vegetables, having a drip irrigation system can be very helpful for that. But oftentimes, if we have rains or dry conditions, it's very easy for blossom end rot to occur in gardens. Now, if you have this early in the season, particularly with tomatoes, you may see this with your first few tomatoes. Remove those, dispose of them outside the area of the garden, and often the problem will resolve itself. There are also calcium supplements that can be applied. Rot Stop is a liquid version that has a calcium product in it that can be applied to the soil in order to assist the plants. But again, this really is a watering problem rather than being a calcium deficiency in the soil. Another frequent problem that we see in all types of gardens is potentially pesticide exposure. So there's an example here, really common, unfortunately. Someone's using glyphosate in their home landscape. It's very easy for pesticides or herbicides to drift and cause this damage to the plants in our vegetable gardens. So these are examples of Roundup damage. You can see that really characteristic white color on the leaves. That can be a sign that you may have experienced some damage from glyphosate or Roundup. Another common herbicide that we use in the home landscape is 2,4-D. A lot of different trade names for 2,4-D, just like there's a lot of different trade names for glyphosate. And 2,4-D really gives a characteristic kind of stretched out appearance to the leaves and other parts of the plant. Just looks like the plant is overgrowing. Again, 2,4-D damage to plants really occurs very often as we're using it in the landscape. If we're not careful, occasionally some small amount of that herbicide can get onto the other plants where we don't want them to be and cause this damage. What can be a good news about things like this is damage from these herbicides is kind of just what I call a point event. So it happens, and if it doesn't kill the plant is very likely to recover. But what we want to do when we're using herbicides in the home landscape, and they are essential tools for helping us manage weeds and just making our growing a lot easier and a lot more pleasant. We just want to make sure that we're careful to avoid drift avoid getting that herbicide on plants that we don't want to damage, and avoid these problems that way. When we talk about plant nutrient deficiency, that just means that there is some nutrient that the plant requires that it's unable to get from the soil. And it can be very difficult to identify plant nutrient deficiencies. Some diseases, particularly some viruses, might have symptoms that look really similar to plant nutrient deficiencies. So one of the ways we figure out if we have a nutrient deficiency is looking at, are all of the plants that are in an area affected fairly similarly? So if we're planted in the ground, all of those plants are relying on the same soil. So we would expect that if we have a nutrient deficiency, we're going to see fairly uniform symptoms across all the plants. We're also not going to see those symptoms just appear all of a sudden. They tend to just occur a little bit more gradually, because again, it just relates to what nutrients can be taken up by the plants. Some symptoms that we might see in nutrient deficiencies, again, chlorosis is really yellowing, really general sign of nutrient deficiencies. That might be intraveinal chlorosis, where we have that symptom appearing, leaving that dark green color on the veins and then the yellow color in the space between those veins. We also may see necrosis, either marginally or in spots, which is just dying tissue on the leaf, as a sign of these nutrient deficiencies. Now, of course, the best way to make sure that we have everything that the plant needs there in the soil is to use soil testing. Soil testing, of course, done by the Mississippi State University Extension Soil Testing Lab. I really think this is the best $8 that you can spend in horticulture. You collect those samples from around your landscape. You're going to dig down to about 4 to 6 inches, collect that soil, do that 15 to 20 different spots all around your landscape, put that into a bag, bring that into your county extension office with a check or a money order for $8. We're going to send that off to the State Soil Testing Lab in Starkville, and they are going to come back with exactly how we need to fertilize, exactly how we need to use lime, in order to produce the optimal plant growth that we could get. And so I do know we are going a little bit longer with everything going on. Sometimes those samples do take a little bit longer to get back. The Soil Testing Lab is doing a fantastic job working to get those samples back to people. So I encourage you to do that. It's one of the few things we do have a fee for, but it absolutely, with the wealth of information that you can get back from that, is absolutely well worth it to just get around any potential problem that you may have with fertilization. And I do want to quickly mention, if you are having a serious problem with a particular plant, we can actually do plant tissue sample analysis. And in that, we're actually taking a sample of the plant and sending it in. And that looks at how the plant is actually taking up those nutrients that are there in the soil. But for the vast majority of situations, almost every situation for a homeowner, using soil testing is everything you need in order to get all of the information about how you should fertilize and avoid any nutrient deficiencies. Now, moving on from abiotic problems of plants to some biotic pathogens, I'm going to talk about fungal pathogens and bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. There are a few special cases that I'm not going to mention, but they tend to be more uncommon. Absolutely, the most common plant diseases that you'll run into, or at least biotic plant diseases, are going to be fungi. A little bit less commonly than that is bacteria, and then viruses and nematodes, probably about the same. So as we talk about fungal diseases, it's important that we understand that we can really break fungal diseases down into two big categories: foliar diseases and vascular diseases. So a foliar disease, foliar means leaf, so we see the lesions or the damage caused by that fungus on the foliage of the plant. And when we look at those lesions, those sites on the plant where we're seeing the damage. Oftentimes, if we look really closely or maybe use a magnifying glass, we can actually see spores in the center of that lesion. You can see the reproductive structures of the fungus there in the center as the fungus is growing. With vascular diseases, it can be a little bit difficult because the fungus is actually growing inside the plant. So often we're going to see discoloration, and often we're going to see wilt affecting that plant. So the plant has a fungus inside the tissue or the cells that normally transport water and nutrients to the plant, and that results in the plant wilting. So if we were to cut that plant open, we can then look inside. We can actually see that vascular tissue may be discolored, maybe kind of brownish, because the fungus is there in that tissue. So just to give a really common example of a foliar disease that we see in vegetable gardens, early blight is a really common disease of tomatoes, probably the most common disease of tomatoes that we run into. And I'd like to thank Dr. Sayed Shabanajevich, my former major professor, for my borrowing his slide on early blight for this presentation. Now, when we first see early blight, it shows up on the lower leaves of the plant with those brownish lesions. What's happened is water has splashed that up from the ground or from fallen leaves and splashed it up onto the leaf, and it'll move up the plant as it's splashed around by the movement of water. So the number of lesions will continue to increase. It can eventually cause severe defoliation of the plant. You will occasionally see it damage the top of the tomato where it attaches the plant. You can see an example there at the picture on the right. You may also see it affecting the branches. It may actually create a lesion that completely encircles a branch. Call that collar rot, and it leads to the death of the branch as all the tissue that would transport nutrients is destroyed. So that's early blight. One of the things that's really important for early blight is the removal of any tissue or fallen leaves, because again, that's really going to serve as a way to introduce that disease back onto the healthy plants. Talk really quick about bacterial diseases. Oftentimes, we're going to see those same lesions on the plant. For bacterial diseases, we often say they look water-soaked, just a response of the plant to the infection. You may see a little bit of an ooze coming out of that infected area, and that ooze actually carries the bacterium, so it gets splashed around by water and will spread the bacteria from plant to plant. We also might see cankers or blights on the plant. A canker is kind of an abnormal growth, whereas a blight, we have a death of branch, but all of the leaves tend to stay on there. We can also see really rapid wilt as a result of bacterial infection. In fact, bacterial wilt is a really common disease. Unfortunately, in vegetable gardens, it's common on a wide range of different plants. What happens is the bacterium actually gets into the vascular tissue, or again, those transport cells in the plant, and just multiplies in there. It eventually blocks up those cells so nutrients can't be moved around the plant. Again, it survives in the soil, and it can survive in the soil for an extended period of time. And so one of the things we need to do if we have bacterial wilt is try to select species of plant to grow there that aren't affected in order to avoid growing something there that the bacterium can affect and continue to spread. When we talk about viral diseases, a virus is what we call a submicroscopic obligate intercellular parasite. So what that means is that the viruses are so small we can't even see them with a light microscope. We have to use special microscopes to see them. An intracellular parasite means that it actually parasitizes whatever it's affecting by getting inside the cell and replicating in that cell using the machinery that the cell would normally use for its own purposes. And when we say obligate, what that means is that it really can't reproduce outside of the cell of its host. So that puts all of those pieces together. And some symptoms that we might see on viruses, very often we'll see stunting of plants or some yellowing, again, that fancy word chlorosis. We also might see leaf distortion. Two really characteristic symptoms of viruses that we see, first of all, are mottling, where you can see, again, that general lighter color of the leaf, and then those darker colored raised areas. That's what we refer to as a mottle or a mosaic. And then ring spots. And ring spots, just what it sounds like. It's a spot, but it kind of has a ring-like shape to it. You can see actually a better picture of ring spot down in the bottom right of this picture. This is tomato spotted wilt virus. One of the things that's great about viruses is that their naming for plant viruses starts with the plant that's affected by it or the plant it was discovered in, a description of its symptoms, and then the word virus. So we can understand that tomato spotted wilt virus occurs in tomato and, in fact, a wide range of different other plants. It causes spots and wilt, and it's a virus. So it's tomato spotted wilt virus. This virus actually has the widest host range of any known plant virus, almost 1,100 species affected, and it causes wilt as well as ring spot. Occasionally, we'll see that bronzing coloration on young leaves. And this virus is transmitted by an insect called a thrips. Feeds on the leaf, on the underside of the leaf, also feeds in the flowers. But the transmission of the virus is by the feeding of that insect. And that can be really important because one of the things we want to make sure we do in order to control the transmission of plant viruses is remove those insects like aphids and thrips and whiteflies that may be responsible for spreading them. If we do have viruses, another really important thing to do is to remove those virus-affected plants from the garden to prevent them from serving as a way that the virus can be spread to other plants. All right, talk here about nematodes. Nematodes are an interesting organism. They're actually a kind of worm that lives in the soil, not like the earthworms. They're actually an unsegmented worm, and they feed on plant roots. So plants that are affected by them can be yellowish or dwarfed. And when this happens, really all the plants that are going to be in an area are going to be affected, and that area will slowly expand as the nematodes expand the area that they're infesting. One thing that can be really difficult to deal with nematodes is that there really isn't just a way that we can apply a chemical to get rid of them. So they can be kind of difficult to manage. We'll see an example here. Probably the most common one we run into is root knot nematode, named very much because of the symptoms that it causes. So the female nematode bites onto the root system of the plant that it's attacking, starts to feed off the plant, of course lays eggs, and that female nematode stays right there, and the plant forms a gall or knot around that female. And so you see the root system there that has all of those different little knots on it, all those galls. See an example from tomato and an example from carrot, caused by the feeding of those female nematodes. So one thing that we can do for control of nematodes is use resistant varieties. So some varieties of particular vegetables are more resistant to feeding by them, more resistant to forming these knots. You can rotate out to other plants that are less affected by root knot nematode, things like broccoli and cauliflower, canola, not something that we normally grow very much of in our vegetable gardens, but another plant that's resistant. Interestingly, French marigolds in particular are a great plant to introduce in areas where we have nematodes, because there's some chemical activity, some chemistry that's released from the plant roots that seems to have some activity in reducing nematode problems. All right. The most important things that we can do in order to manage disease in our vegetable garden. First of these, and probably the most important one that we can talk about, is sanitation. Sanitation is just removing any sources of potential disease from the area of the garden. So if you have infested plants, you want to remove those plants, get them out of the area where the garden is going to be. Make sure that you've cleaned up fallen leaves, or at the end of the season that you're removing any plant residue from the garden area, getting rid of that, because that can serve as a source for infestations of that disease when you reintroduce plants into the garden area. Just a quick note there, if you're gardening like me, my vegetable garden is in containers. So if you're doing that, cleaning your pots, cleaning all the tools you use in order to prevent the spread of disease is very important. You can use either a bleach solution or a vinegar solution, 10% solution of either, which is just 1 part of bleach or vinegar to 9 parts water. Very effective at removing some of these biotic pathogens from your tools and from your containers. Make sure your watering is the best it can be. Of course, we want to avoid problems with blossom end rot. We don't want our plants to be under drought conditions, and we don't want to overwater. But another really important factor when we talk about watering and plant disease is that, particularly for fungi and for bacteria, in the foliar diseases, they require an extended period of time where the plant actually has free water, or where the leaves are wet. So it may require 6 or 8 hours of leaves being wet in order for that fungi or bacteria to successfully infest the plant. So when you're watering, again, drip systems are fantastic for this because they're avoiding that leaf wetness problem entirely. But when you're watering, water at the base of the plant. Don't water right in the early morning, so let the plants dry off in the sun. Water in the earlier part of the day so that we're avoiding extended periods of time when the leaves are wet. Mulches are a fantastic way to help control disease. A lot of disease organisms will overwinter or stay in the soil. And by using a mulch, whether it be a plastic mulch or an organic mulch, you're putting a barrier between the soil and the plant, preventing that from being a way that the disease can spread. Use resistant varieties, particularly if you have a history of that problem. If you know you've had lots of early blight or other different diseases, bacteria will use a resistant variety at every opportunity. Look for that information in the seed catalogs that you purchase, or that you purchase from, rather. Ask your county extension agent. Look up that information on your extension website because that information on resistant varieties is going to be very valuable to you in helping you deal with plant disease. Make sure any plants that you introduce into your garden are free of disease. Make sure they're free of insects as well, particularly if you're purchasing vegetable transplants. Check them over really well. Make sure you don't see any lesions on them, any brown spots or anything like that. Make sure that they don't have aphids or whiteflies before you introduce them into the home garden. That's going to do a lot of good just to avoid accidentally introducing anything into the home landscape. Forest fungicides are an important part of managing fungal diseases in the home garden. And similarly to how I discussed this for insecticides, it's absolutely a great idea to use these fungicides. They're very effective. We want to make sure that we're using them in accordance with the label that they have. So we're using them on a crop that we can use them on for a particular disease that we can control with that product. we're using them at the right rate, we're using the protective equipment that we need, we're paying attention to any pre-harvest interval that they may have, fungicides can be a fantastic tool to help us out managing disease in the home landscape. We want to make sure that we're using them correctly. So that is the end of the presentation there. I do want to take